She stepped into the luxury boutique wearing a simple cotton sundress, a worn denim jacket, and faded ballet flats that had clearly seen better days. The boutique was a shrine to extravagance, its polished marble floors gleaming under the soft golden lighting, its racks draped with dresses that seemed to float in the air like works of art. Perfumed air drifted from carefully placed diffusers, and soft orchestral music floated through the spacious room. From the moment she entered, the atmosphere shifted. The nearest sales associate, a tall woman with a sleek bun and an expression sharpened to a fine point, turned toward her with a practiced smile that did little to hide her true thoughts. Sweeping her eyes from the scuffed flats upward, the associate took in the simple dress, the bare face, and the hair pulled back with a plain elastic. Without missing a beat, she stepped in front of the woman's path, her tone polite but laced with condescension. "I am sorry, but our dresses start at $20,000, she said crisply, as though reciting a line rehearsed many times before. Across the boutique, another sales associate glanced up from folding silk scarves and smirked, nudging a colleague beside her. A pair of impeccably dressed customers, draped in designer labels and glittering jewelry, watched with barely concealed amusement. The woman's cheeks flushed, but she said nothing. She simply nodded, murmured a soft thank you, and turned back toward the door she had just entered. Her departure was marked by the chiming of the entrance bell and a ripple of soft laughter that chased her into the bright morning air. No one asked her what she had come for. No one cared to wonder why she had chosen this boutique among all the others in the city. To them, she was a misplaced wanderer, a dreamer lost in a world where reality wore price tags higher than most mortgages. But the story was far from over. The next morning, as the boutique opened its doors for a new day of curated elegance, a spectacle unfolded that no one inside could have anticipated. A silver Rolls-Royce Phantom, its paint glinting like liquid mercury under the rising sun, pulled up directly in front of the boutique's expansive glass facade. Heads turned. The uniformed chauffeur, wearing a sharp dark suit and gleaming white gloves, stepped from the driver's seat and circled to the rear door, which he opened with a graceful, practiced movement. From within the luxurious vehicle emerged a man whose very bearing demanded attention. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit tailored to perfection. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, and his polished shoes clicked authoritatively against the marble entryway. Conversation halted. Employees straightened. The same sales associate who had turned away the woman the day before instinctively stepped forward, her smile wide and brittle, ready to greet what she assumed was a client of importance, the kind of man who might drop $500,000 without blinking. His gaze swept over the boutique with cool detachment, taking in every gilded fixture, every silken display. He walked with the easy confidence of a man used to commanding rooms much grander than this one, but there was no arrogance in his bearing, only a quiet authority that needed no embellishment. The sales associate nearly stumbled in her eagerness to intercept him, extending a hand in welcome. "Good morning, sir, and welcome to Maison Leclerc," she purred. "It would be our honor to assist you today." The man's sharp blue eyes fixed on her, and for a moment she faltered under the weight of his gaze. "I am looking for the manager," he said simply, his voice low and even but carrying an unmistakable edge. The associate's smile faltered. "Of course, sir. Right away," she stammered, retreating to summon the boutique's director, a man named Charles Hampton, who had built his career on catering to the city's elite. Charles arrived moments later, his own smile polished to a mirror shine, extending his hand warmly. "Welcome to Maison Leclerc, sir. I am Charles Hampton, the boutique manager. How may we be of service?" The man regarded him for a moment before speaking. "My name is Alexander Turner," he said, "and I believe you owe my wife an apology." A hush fell over the boutique. Associates froze. Customers craned their necks to hear. Even the music seemed to dim. Charles blinked, confused. "I'm not certain I understand, sir. Your wife?" Alexander nodded slowly, his expression hardening. "Yesterday morning, my wife, Margaret Turner, visited this boutique. She was interested in selecting a gift for her best friend's birthday. Instead, she was turned away at the door because of her appearance. No one asked her name. No one asked her purpose. She was judged solely by the clothes she wore." Charles's face drained of color. He glanced at the sales associate who had greeted Alexander, her smile now frozen into a grimace. "I deeply apologize, Mr. Turner," Charles began, his voice stumbling over itself. "If there was any misunderstanding, there was no misunderstanding," Alexander interrupted, his voice calm but steely. "There was a presumption, there was arrogance, and there was discrimination. It speaks volumes about the true values held here, values I find disappointing, especially for an establishment that prides itself on exclusivity." Around them, the boutique staff fidgeted nervously. Some customers quietly made their way toward the exit, sensing a scandal brewing. Alexander's gaze remained fixed on Charles, unyielding. "My wife is not a woman who demands attention. She does not parade her wealth. She believes that true worth lies not in appearance, but in actions. And yet she was treated as if she did not belong here." He paused, letting the words sink in as the full weight of the situation pressed down on the trembling boutique staff. Charles Hampton swallowed hard as he watched Alexander Turner exit the boutique with the same grace and dignity that seemed to have abandoned the staff within its walls. The remaining associates stood frozen, some looking shamefaced, others too stunned to move. The sales associate who had first insulted Margaret Turner could hardly meet anyone's gaze, her hands trembling as she fiddled aimlessly with a rack of scarves. Emma, the junior associate who had assisted Alexander, tucked the black card receipt carefully into the boutique's safe, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never witnessed anything like it, not just the authority Alexander Turner had commanded, but the quiet, devastating precision with which he had exposed the very rot that lay beneath the store's polished surface. Charles knew that news of this would travel fast. Their clientele, so obsessed with image and reputation, would not look kindly upon a boutique where word of public humiliation and judgment based on appearance was spreading. He felt the walls closing in, the entire curated perfection of Maison Leclerc cracking with each whispered conversation between lingering customers. By noon, social media posts had already begun surfacing. A well-known blogger had been shopping nearby and had captured part of the exchange on her phone. Though she had not caught every word, the meaning was clear. The boutique that prided itself on exclusivity had exposed an ugliness that no amount of polished marble could hide. The video showed Alexander Turner, unbending and calm, defending his wife's dignity against a sea of shallow judgment. Within hours, comments flooded in, many from people who had once dreamed of shopping at Maison Leclerc, but now declared they would never set foot inside its doors. By late afternoon, Charles Hampton found himself fielding frantic calls from the boutique's corporate office, each executive more furious than the last. They demanded explanations, demanded damage control, demanded results. Charles knew there was little he could do. The truth had been laid bare, and no scripted apology could erase the image of Alexander Turner standing in that boutique, calmly dismantling their carefully constructed illusions. Even so, he instructed every associate to review emergency public relations protocols and scheduled an immediate meeting to discuss mandatory training in diversity, equity, and inclusion, though he knew it would be too little, too late. They had not just lost a sale, they had lost something far more valuable, their credibility. Meanwhile, as Maison Leclerc reeled from the fallout, Margaret Turner sat on the sun-drenched patio of their family estate, a book resting open but forgotten on her lap. Amelia, her childhood friend and the intended recipient of the gown, sat across from her, sipping iced tea and laughing at something one of the dogs had done. The afternoon air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine, and for a while, the world outside the estate's high stone walls seemed distant and unimportant. Margaret had told Amelia only part of what had happened at the boutique. She had not needed to explain the rest. Amelia, who had faced her own battles for dignity and respect during her long illness, understood all too well the sting of being judged by appearances. When Alexander returned from his errand, he found the two women lost in conversation, their laughter embalmed the weariness he carried from the morning's confrontation. He stepped onto the patio, holding the carefully wrapped package behind his back. Margaret looked up, and her face softened into a smile. "I take it the mission was successful," she said, setting aside her tea. Alexander returned her smile with a warmth reserved only for her. "Better than you might imagine," he said, handing her the package. Margaret unwrapped it carefully, revealing the navy blue gown that had first caught her eye. Amelia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Is that? Margaret turned the gown toward her with a flourish. Happy early birthday, she said. Tears filled Amelia's eyes as she rose to embrace her friend. I do not know what to say, she whispered. You do not have to say anything, Margaret replied, hugging her tightly. You deserve every happiness this life can offer. Alexander watched the exchange, his heart swelling with pride and love. This was why he had acted, why he had walked into that boutique and held them accountable, not for vengeance, not for pride, but to ensure that kindness and decency were never mistaken for weakness again. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the patio, the three friends sat together, savoring a peace that no amount of wealth or status could manufacture. And somewhere back in the city, in a boutique now scrambling to rebuild its shattered image, a lesson had been planted, a lesson about humility, about worth, and about the quiet strength of a simple woman who had never needed designer labels to know her value. The following morning, Maison Leclerc was a different place. The boutique that once buzzed with quiet arrogance now trembled under a cloud of tension and uncertainty. Charles Hampton had gathered the entire staff for a mandatory meeting before the store even opened, his face lined with exhaustion after a sleepless night of damage control. The corporate office had demanded immediate action, not because of genuine remorse, but because of the fear of financial loss. Negative reviews had flooded the internet overnight. Influencers who had once praised the boutique now posted long captions about hidden prejudice behind polished windows. Loyal customers canceled appointments. Reservations for the upcoming winter gala, an event Maison Leclerc hosted every year, dropped by half within 24 hours. Charles stood before his staff, clutching a printed statement drafted hastily by the corporate legal team, promising a renewed commitment to inclusivity and respect. He read it aloud, his voice wooden, while associates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. When he finished, he folded the paper and looked out at them, the weight of reality pressing down hard. We are implementing new training immediately, he said. Participation is not optional. I expect full cooperation. He paused, then added, and there will be changes to how we assess customers. No assumptions, no judgments. Everyone deserves the same respect, regardless of how they look. His eyes lingered meaningfully on the sales associate who had turned away Margaret Turner, who sat rigid in her chair, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Across the room, Emma sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, trying not to draw attention to herself even as she felt the undercurrent of resentment directed her way. She had done nothing wrong. She had done what was right. And yet in a world built on appearances, doing the right thing was not always rewarded with kindness. After the meeting, the boutique opened its doors to a trickle of customers, many of whom arrived not to shop but to observe. The damage had been done. The grandeur had been tarnished. It would take more than glossy apologies to rebuild what had been lost. At the Turner estate, however, the mood was far lighter. Margaret spent the morning finalizing plans for Amelia's birthday celebration, while Alexander worked in his study, fielding calls from various business partners. Word of what had happened at Maison Leclerc had traveled fast, even among the elite circles Alexander often moved in. A few close acquaintances reached out, some to express outrage, others to commend him for his actions. Alexander accepted the praise with quiet humility, never forgetting that the true victory belonged not in public approval, but in standing up for what mattered. As afternoon settled over the sprawling estate, Margaret received an unexpected call. It was Charles Hampton, his voice tight with anxiety and strained politeness. He stumbled through an apology, offered personal shopping services, exclusive previews of new collections, even donations to her foundation. Margaret listened patiently, then thanked him for his call without committing to anything. She hung up the phone and smiled ruefully. The gesture was not born of sincerity. It was born of fear, and fear, she knew, was a poor substitute for true change. Later that evening, Margaret and Alexander attended a charity event at the city's historic library, a gathering of philanthropists and community leaders supporting literacy programs. As they moved through the elegant ballroom, Margaret noticed how differently people treated her compared to how she had been treated at the boutique. Here, dressed in a simple but elegant navy gown, she was greeted warmly, with deference and respect. No one questioned her place. No one doubted her worth. It was a stark reminder of how thin the veneer of society could be, how quickly perceptions shifted based on nothing more than fabric and stitching. Alexander sensed her thoughts and squeezed her hand gently. "Let them see who you are," he whispered. "Not for their sake, for yours." Margaret smiled, the words anchoring her, reminding her that no matter the setting, no matter the judgment of strangers, her worth was not up for negotiation. It had been forged long ago in the fires of struggle, compassion, and perseverance, and no dismissive glance or haughty smirk could diminish it. The music swelled, the laughter rose, and the night unfolded with quiet grace. Somewhere across town, Maison Leclerc struggled to piece itself back together. But here, in this moment, Margaret Turner stood unshaken, a simple woman who had never needed designer approval to know the immeasurable value of her own soul. Charles Hampton had spent the early hours of the morning poring over internal reports and customer feedback, trying to make sense of the unfolding crisis at Maison Leclerc. The boutique, once the epitome of refinement and selective exclusivity, was now a battlefield of reputation and integrity. Employees huddled in whispered clusters in the spacious back office as Charles methodically outlined his plans for a complete cultural overhaul. In hushed voices, they discussed the ramifications of being associated with a brand tarnished by an incident that had been caught on video and shared widely on social media. It was a moment of reckoning, one that forced every staff member to confront not only their own assumptions, but also the very foundation of the standards they had been forced to uphold. Outside, the city continued in its usual flurry, unaware of the turmoil that had shaken one of its most admired establishments. Yet within the boutique, the atmosphere was somber. The polished glass counters and meticulously arranged displays now served as silent witnesses to a collective fall from grace. Some of the more seasoned associates recalled a time when true elegance was believed to reside in service and respect, not just in opulent furnishings and designer labels. Charles addressed them again, urging that a transformation must begin with an honest appraisal of their behavior. He spoke of humility and the shared responsibility of creating an environment where every person, regardless of how they appeared, would feel welcome. His words did not erase the sting of the previous day, yet they planted a seed of hope that perhaps change was possible. The corporate directive that followed demanded immediate action. A series of workshops on diversity and inclusion was swiftly arranged, and every staff member was scheduled for a session with a consultant experienced in unconscious bias. In the midst of these sweeping changes, a lone voice emerged from a corner of the shop floor. Emma, the junior associate whose steady and sincere manner had been the only ray of light during the confrontation with Mr. Turner, found herself at the center of an unexpectedly positive new narrative. Despite her tender age and relatively brief tenure at Maison Leclerc, she was commended by both her peers and superiors for her professionalism and for standing up for what was right. Her actions became a symbol, a quiet but powerful reminder that genuine kindness often shone through the veneer of opulence. As the day wore on, the boutique began to slowly reopen its doors to curious customers. Some came with skepticism etched in every feature, others with a cautious hope that the storied Maison Leclerc might reclaim its honor. Throughout the day, whispers of the incident mingled with tentative reassurances from management. Charles himself made rounds, speaking to each customer with an earnestness that had not been seen before. Yet beneath his carefully constructed promises, there lingered an unspoken understanding that trust once lost was not easily regained. In that fragile exchange of words and glances, the true cost of pride and the value of humility revealed itself. Every intricate detail of the boutique, from the curated selection of gowns to the aromatic blend of luxury perfumes, was now underscored by a deeper narrative of redemption and transformation. It was a moment that held the promise of rebirth, but required the courage to confront and admit past wrongs. Meanwhile, beyond the hushed conversations and reflective silence of Maison Leclerc, the ripple effects of the previous day's events began to extend far beyond the boutique's ornate doors. Social media platforms buzzed with debates, and newspaper articles dissected the incident with a clinical precision. Profiles of Margaret Turner and Alexander Turner dominated headlines, a stark reminder that genuine merit and authentic character could challenge the entrenched hierarchies of wealth and elitism. Public opinion was divided. Some lauded Alexander Turner for his decisive stand against discrimination, championing his belief that worth was measured by character rather than appearance. Others, clinging to outdated notions of exclusivity, voiced skepticism and defended the long-standing traditions of the luxury retail world. Yet for many, the incident had sparked a broader conversation about the true essence of refinement. At community centers and local cafes, discussions unfolded over steaming cups of coffee about the meaning of respect and dignity in a society that too often valued material splendor over humane warmth. In one such gathering, a local business owner recounted how his own modest beginnings had taught him that success was not determined by the price tags of one's attire, but by the strength of one's vision and heart. As the conversation gathered momentum, it became clear that the lesson from Maison Leclerc was not confined to a single boutique or moment in time. It resonated with an entire generation seeking authenticity in a world overwhelmed by superficial judgments. Back at the boutique, the employees, now acutely aware of the external scrutiny, resolved to work harder, to rebuild not just a brand image, but the bonds of trust with every customer who crossed their threshold. Charles Hampton spent long hours drafting new procedures, determined that the forthcoming training sessions would not be mere formalities, but genuine opportunities for transformation. In quiet moments, he reflected on the irony that a space once defined by its ostentation now had the chance to redefine the very notion of luxury through humility and empathy. As evening draped the city in soft shadows, the renewed Maison Leclerc closed its doors with a sense of cautious optimism. The journey ahead was steep, and the scar of the previous day would take time to heal, but there was a promise in the air, a promise that every challenge carried an opportunity, and that even in the face of ingrained elitism, a simple act of decency could spark a revolution of the heart. The city slept that night with thoughts of change lingering in the dark, and somewhere in the realm of luxury and legacy, a new story began to be written, one page at a time, with every step taken in courage and every gesture imbued with sincerity. 2 weeks later, the annual Winter Charity Gala approached, an event long associated with Maison Leclerc's elite clientele and a showcase of high society's opulence. Traditionally, the boutique would have dominated the evening, their most exclusive designs worn by celebrities and dignitaries alike, their name mentioned in every article and whispered admiringly in every conversation. This year, however, things were different. The incident involving Margaret Turner had left a lasting impression, one that could not be erased by a few public statements or hastily arranged training seminars. Whispers circulated that the gala's organizers had considered distancing themselves from Maison Leclerc entirely, but had been persuaded at the last moment by promises of reform and pledges to support more inclusive charitable efforts. Still, the boutique's presence at the event was notably more subdued. Charles Hampton moved through the grand ballroom that evening with careful steps, acutely aware of the curious and sometimes judgmental eyes following him. He had spent the past weeks orchestrating a campaign of contrition, reaching out to community leaders, offering donations, and meeting with consultants who specialized in repairing damaged reputations. And yet, beneath the glimmering chandeliers and the strains of the live orchestra, he knew that true redemption would require more than polished words and symbolic gestures. It would require authenticity, a quality that could not be manufactured or bought. Toward the center of the ballroom, Alexander Turner and Margaret Turner made their entrance with a grace that turned heads not because of ostentation, but because of the quiet dignity they exuded. Margaret wore a simple yet stunning gown of deep emerald green, her hair swept back in a modest chignon, her jewelry understated but elegant. Alexander, in a classic black tuxedo, kept close by her side, his presence steady and reassuring. Conversations momentarily hushed as the couple moved through the crowd, many guests feeling a quiet awe in their wake. They greeted acquaintances with genuine warmth, accepted compliments with humility, and listened attentively as others shared their stories and aspirations. It was this authenticity, more than any designer label or grand title, that made the Turners stand apart. They belonged not because they demanded admiration, but because they commanded respect through the sheer force of their character. Near the far side of the ballroom, Charles Hampton spotted them and hesitated. Approaching them would not be easy, but he knew it was necessary. Taking a deep breath, he crossed the floor and paused a respectful distance away. "Mr. Turner, Mrs. Turner." He inclined his head slightly, his voice steady despite the nerves tightening in his chest. "May I have a moment of your time?" Alexander turned, his expression unreadable. Margaret offered a polite, neutral smile. "Of course, Charles," Margaret said, her voice even. Charles drew in another breath. "I wanted to personally apologize again for the way you were treated at Maison Leclerc. We have taken significant steps to ensure that such a thing never happens again. We have begun comprehensive training for all staff, and we are committed to fostering a culture of respect and inclusivity moving forward." Margaret listened without interrupting, her expression calm but distant. When Charles finished speaking, she considered him for a long moment. "I appreciate the efforts you are making," she said finally. "But true change is not measured by apologies or policies. It is measured by how you treat people when no one is watching." Charles nodded, the words striking deeper than he cared to admit. "Of course," he said quietly. "Thank you for your grace." He inclined his head once more and excused himself, leaving Margaret and Alexander to continue their evening. Across the ballroom, Amelia joined them, radiant in the navy gown Margaret had gifted her, her laughter bright and infectious. The three friends stood together, a small island of sincerity in a sea of pretense, and for a moment the glittering opulence of the gala faded into the background. It was not the jewels or the designer gowns that defined the evening. It was the quiet power of kindness, the resilience of dignity, and the reminder that true worth could never be stitched into fabric or hung on a hanger. As the night drew on, Margaret and Alexander danced slowly under the sweeping arches of the ballroom ceiling, the music a soft hum around them. Margaret rested her head against Alexander's shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath the crisp fabric of his tuxedo. They had weathered storms before, storms far greater than the judgment of strangers, and they would weather many more. In the end, it was not the battles they remembered, but the victories of the spirit, the moments when they stood firm, when they refused to let the world's shallow values dictate their own. And somewhere across the city, in the heart of a boutique trying desperately to remember what true service meant, seeds of real change were taking root, watered by the quiet courage of a woman who had never needed to prove her worth to anyone but herself. The days that followed the Winter Charity Gala marked a noticeable shift in the atmosphere around the city's elite circles. Conversations that once revolved around the latest luxury acquisitions and exclusive invitations now turned to discussions about authenticity, humility, and the quiet power of standing firm for what was right. Margaret Turner found herself at the center of these conversations not because she sought the attention, but because her story resonated far beyond the walls of Maison Leclerc. She had become a symbol, not of rebellion, but of quiet dignity, a reminder that appearances could deceive and that true character was revealed not in moments of grandeur, but in the small, often unseen choices to act with kindness and courage. Invitations arrived in waves, requests for interviews, profiles, keynote speeches at women's leadership conferences. Margaret declined them all politely, choosing instead to continue her work with the Turner Foundation. She believed change did not happen in front of flashing cameras or crowded ballrooms. It happened in classrooms where young girls were taught to value their voices, in hospitals where sick children received the care they deserved, in quiet corners where someone who once felt invisible was finally seen. Alexander supported her decision without question, knowing that her strength had never needed validation from the public eye. Meanwhile, Emma, the young associate from Maison Leclerc, continued to grow into her role as a quiet leader within the boutique. Charles Hampton, recognizing her natural empathy and integrity, entrusted her with mentoring new hires, ensuring that the next generation of staff would carry forward the lessons so painfully learned. It was not an easy process. There were stumbles, moments when old habits reared their heads, moments when it would have been easier to slip back into old patterns of judgment and assumption. But Emma persisted, armed not with lectures, but with example, showing every day that respect was not something reserved for the wealthy or the glamorous, but something owed to every human being who crossed their threshold. Slowly, Maison Leclerc began to rebuild, not by chasing prestige, but by cultivating sincerity. In the quiet moments, Margaret reflected on how a single experience, painful though it had been, had rippled outward into something larger than herself. She thought about the countless people who had been dismissed, judged, or overlooked simply because they did not fit the mold of what society deemed valuable. She thought about Amelia, who had once sat in hospital waiting rooms surrounded by silence, about her own mother, who had raised a family with nothing but determination and love, about every child her foundation touched who deserved to grow up in a world where worth was not measured in designer logos or marble foyers. It had never been about a gown. It had never been about a boutique. It had been about the fundamental truth that every soul carried an intrinsic worth that no one had the right to diminish. One afternoon, while visiting a new community center funded by the Turner Foundation, Margaret watched a group of children painting a mural on the side of the building. Bright colors splashed across the brick, forming images of hope, dreams, and togetherness. A little girl, her braids swinging as she worked, looked up at Margaret and beamed. "You are the lady who made this place happen," she said shyly. Margaret knelt beside her, dipping her brush into a pot of sky blue paint. "No, sweetheart," she said with a gentle smile. "You are the ones making it happen. I just helped." Together they added strokes to the mural, side by side. No pretense, no judgment, just the pure joy of creating something beautiful. Across the city, Maison Leclerc remained a place of luxury, but it had changed in ways more profound than a redesigned logo or a refurbished showroom could ever convey. And as for Margaret Turner, she continued her life much the same way she always had, with quiet strength, unwavering purpose, and the unshakable knowledge that true elegance was never worn on the body, but carried within the heart. The world around her would keep spinning, full of its distractions and superficialities, but Margaret had chosen her path long ago, and in that choice, she had reminded everyone watching that sometimes the most powerful revolution begins not with grand speeches or sweeping gestures, but with a simple woman who refuses to let the world tell her who she is. 1 month later, the Turner Foundation hosted its annual Celebration of Hope Gala at the Grand Metropolitan Hotel, a glittering event filled not with celebrities seeking attention, but with teachers, healthcare workers, community leaders, and the families whose lives had been touched by the Foundation's work. It was an evening of warmth and authenticity, where laughter echoed louder than champagne toasts, and where the spotlight shone not on wealth, but on resilience and compassion. Margaret stood near the entrance of the ballroom, greeting guests with her characteristic grace. She wore a flowing dress of soft ivory, simple and elegant, her only jewelry a delicate silver pendant shaped like an olive branch, a gift from Amelia. Across the room, Alexander was deep in conversation with a group of young engineers the Foundation had sponsored through university. His easy smile and genuine interest in their dreams made him approachable despite the quiet power he carried. As Margaret made her way through the crowd, she spotted a familiar figure standing somewhat awkwardly near the refreshment table, Emma, the young associate from Maison Leclerc. Margaret's face lit up with a warm smile, and she approached without hesitation. Emma looked up, her eyes widening with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "Mrs. Turner," she stammered, "I did not expect to see you here." Margaret laughed softly. "It is Margaret, please. And you are most welcome here, Emma." "Thank you," Emma said, her voice steadying. "I just wanted to say, what happened at the boutique? It changed me. It changed a lot of us." Margaret regarded her thoughtfully. "Change is never easy," she said, "but it is worth it." Emma nodded fervently. "After everything that happened, Charles gave me a chance to lead our new community outreach program. We are working with local schools and nonprofits to provide career mentoring and opportunities in fashion and business for students from underserved backgrounds." Margaret's smile deepened. "That is wonderful, Emma. I am proud of you." Emma's cheeks flushed with pride. "Thank you, Mrs. Margaret. It means a lot coming from you." They spoke a while longer, Emma sharing stories of the young people she had met through the new program, her enthusiasm infectious. Margaret listened intently, asking questions, offering encouragement. In that moment, the ordeal at Maison Leclerc seemed distant, not because it had been forgotten, but because it had been transformed into something better, something lasting. Later, as the evening's program began, Margaret took her seat at a table near the front of the ballroom beside Alexander and Amelia. The lights dimmed, and a video montage played on giant screens, showcasing the Foundation's work over the past year. Images of smiling children, newly opened community centers, refurbished classrooms, and thriving families filled the screen, each frame a testament to the quiet but powerful change the Foundation had helped create. Margaret felt a lump form in her throat as she watched, not from pride, but from gratitude, for the opportunity to serve, to build, to uplift. When the video ended, Alexander rose to deliver the evening's keynote address. He spoke not of wealth or influence, but of responsibility, of the duty each person carried to use whatever gifts they had been given to make the world a little better, a little kinder. He spoke of Margaret, without naming her, describing the strength it took to meet arrogance with dignity and prejudice with compassion. His words stirred the room, not because they were grandiose, but because they were true. Margaret listened, her heart full, her hand resting lightly on the tablecloth, feeling the quiet pulse of a life lived with purpose. After Alexander's speech, a small award ceremony took place honoring volunteers and community leaders who had gone above and beyond in their service. Margaret smiled warmly as names were called, as tearful acceptance speeches were given, as the spirit of the evening lifted everyone in the room. Toward the end of the night, Charles Hampton approached the stage, looking somewhat uncomfortable but determined. He had been invited not as a guest of honor, but as an example of what it meant to face one's failings and strive for better. He spoke briefly, acknowledging the mistakes made at Maison Leclerc, sharing the changes they had implemented, and pledging continued support for the Turner Foundation's work. His voice wavered slightly as he concluded, but the sincerity in his tone was unmistakable. The audience responded with polite, restrained applause. Redemption, after all, was not awarded freely. It was earned over time, through actions, not words. After the formal program ended, the evening relaxed into a celebration. Music played, and guests mingled freely, sharing laughter, stories, and dreams. Margaret found herself surrounded by children tugging at her sleeves, eager to show her their paintings, their new books, their dance moves. She knelt among them without hesitation, laughing until tears filled her eyes. Across the room, Alexander watched her with a smile of quiet reverence, knowing that this was the truest version of her, the woman who saw beauty where others saw only need, who found wealth not in possessions, but in connections. As the night wore on and the guests began to depart, Margaret and Alexander stood together at the entrance, thanking each person personally. It was nearly midnight when the last guest finally left, and the ballroom fell into a peaceful hush. Margaret leaned against Alexander's shoulder, tired but happy. "It was a good night," she murmured. Alexander kissed the top of her head. It was a night that mattered. They stood there for a long moment, savoring the quiet triumph of knowing they had stayed true to who they were, despite the world's attempts to define them otherwise. In the days and weeks that followed, the Turner Foundation continued its work with renewed vigor. New projects were launched, new partnerships formed. Margaret and Alexander remained steadfast in their mission, guided always by the principles that had carried them through the storm. The belief that dignity was not something to be bestowed by wealth or appearance, but something inherent in every human being. Meanwhile, Maison Leclerc slowly regained some measure of its former prestige, but it was different now. The boutique that had once prided itself solely on exclusivity had learned that true luxury was not found in marble floors or designer labels, but in respect, in humility, in the genuine welcome extended to every person who crossed its threshold. Emma rose steadily within the ranks, eventually being appointed Director of Community Relations, a role she filled with grace and sincerity. Under her guidance, Maison Leclerc sponsored scholarships for aspiring designers from underrepresented communities, hosted free workshops on entrepreneurship, and opened its once exclusive doors to school groups and community organizations. The changes were gradual, often met with resistance, but they took root, transforming not just the boutique, but the lives it touched. And it all began with a simple woman who walked into a store one morning wearing a denim jacket and ballet flats, seeking only a gift for a friend and refusing to let the world's narrow judgments define her worth. Years later, long after the headlines faded and news stories filled the public's attention, people still remembered that moment. They remembered how Margaret Turner had handled humiliation with grace, how Alexander Turner had stood firmly by her side, and how together, without shouting or spectacle, they had changed a corner of the world for the better. Margaret herself rarely spoke of it. To her, it had simply been another test of principle, another opportunity to live the values she held dear. She continued her work quietly, lifting others as she had always done, believing in the slow but powerful ripple effect of kindness and conviction. Alexander continued to build, to innovate, to lead, but never at the expense of his core values. In every boardroom negotiation, in every philanthropic venture, he carried with him the memory of a simple morning at a boutique, a reminder that appearances deceive but actions reveal. And whenever the world seemed to grow too obsessed with status and surface, whenever friends or colleagues lamented the fickleness of public opinion, Alexander would simply smile and say, "Worth is not worn on the body. It is carried in the soul." In the quiet moments when the workday ended and the stars began to twinkle overhead, Margaret and Alexander would sit together on the back terrace of their home, watching the fireflies dance across the gardens. Sometimes they spoke of their dreams for the future, of the projects they hoped to launch, of the lives they still yearned to touch. Other times, they simply sat in comfortable silence, the bond between them needing no words. And in those moments, surrounded by the simple beauty of a world they had helped make a little kinder, they knew beyond any doubt that they had chosen the right path. They had chosen compassion over judgment, dignity over pride, and purpose over prestige. And in doing so, they had found a wealth that no fortune could ever match. It was not a story that would ever be told with grand monuments or history books, but it was written in the lives they touched, in the dreams they nurtured, in the quiet revolutions they sparked in hearts all around them. Margaret Turner never needed a gown to shine, nor a boutique's approval to matter. Her worth, her beauty, her strength had always been hers alone, carried quietly but powerfully within her. And as long as there were people willing to look beyond the surface, willing to meet the world with open hearts instead of closed judgments, her legacy would endure. In a world that so often prized the glitter of appearances, Margaret had chosen instead the enduring brilliance of authenticity. And in doing so, she had changed not only one boutique, not only one community, but countless lives who would remember long after the marble had faded and the lights had dimmed that true greatness is measured not by what we wear, but by how we love, how we serve, and how we see the worth in one another, even when the world fails to see it first. In the end, it was never about the boutique or the gown. It was about standing firm in the quiet truth that every human being carries an unshakable dignity, one that no amount of wealth or status can bestow or take away. Margaret Turner did not just walk into a store that day, she walked into a world shaped by shallow judgments and left behind a message that resonated far deeper than luxury could ever reach. Her story reminds us that worth is not stitched into fabric or wrapped in gold. It is found in the courage to meet cruelty with kindness, to meet ignorance with patience, and to meet arrogance with quiet, unwavering self-respect. And as long as there are those who choose to see with their hearts rather than their eyes, that truth will continue to change the world, one quiet, steadfast soul at a time.